Good morning, everyone. We're right at 10:45, so we're going to go ahead and get started. I hope that actually, whether you came here expecting to hear about university budgeting and financial management or not, you're in the right place because this is the session you probably wanted to be in, whether you knew it or not. I'm Eric Algo. I've had the pleasure of serving as the Executive Vice President and CFO at Texas State University for the past 10 years. And I am joined by an esteemed panel of my friends and colleagues who I will ask to introduce themselves, and collectively we will try to tell you as much as we possibly can about this topic over the next 50 minutes. So Mike, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, I'm Mike Tremonti. I'm the Senior Vice President and Chief Financial Officer at UT Health Houston, or the University of Texas Health Science Center at Houston. I've been with UT in various forms for about 35 years, 20 of which has been at UT Health. Prior to that, I was at UTMB in Galveston, serving in a variety of roles ranging from being controller to chief budget officer to chief cook and bottle washer. It's it's pretty broad and ever changing.
Joseph?
Howdy. My name is Joseph Duran, and I'm with the A&M System Offices. My title there is Chief Administrative Officer. And just a little bit about myself, my wife says I grow roots. And so I came to A&M when I was 17, going on 18, and I never left. Met my wife there, raised our kids there. So I've been started out as a student worker, and this past July I completed 35 years with A&M System, and so I deal with budgets, accounting, HR, just really anything that has to do with money, so resources.
All right. Howdy, Clayton Gibson. I serve as Vice President for Finance and Administration and CFO at University of North Texas, and I've been there for 3.5 years. You've got a pretty good contrast here. Prior to that, I was at a regional institution in the same role for about 9 years. So, the finance operation is going to typically encompass facilities and the bookkeeping, controller's office, budget, transportation, and then anything else in that space. So happy to be here.
Thank you to all of my colleagues. Joseph, we're going to start with you. I know Joseph has an extensive background in university budgeting and has been really a leader around the state on this topic. Could you provide an overview of the primary revenue sources for institutions in your system and how these align with your funding priorities?
Yes, sir. Thank you, Eric. So I'll give you just some background, at least on the A&M system. And, we're made up of, I have to always look at my notes. You think I know it by now, but 11 academics, health science center, and then 8 state research and service agencies. So we kind of have a little bit of everything. Our agencies do a lot of research activities. They do a lot of service, provide different services, workforce development, emergency response. And so then we have also our our academics. And when you look at our total budget for the A&M system, it varies, especially now since we do have the Texas Division of Emergency Management fluctuates. But this year, the board approved a $7.3 billion budget. Almost about 70% of that, though, is really has to do with our academics that we have. And so when we look at just the different revenue sources that we have, 7.3 billion, approximately 5 billion, or 63% has to do with our academics. And so then when you look at the total, when you think about our academics, a lot is funded with general revenue from the state of Texas, and also from tuition fees that are paid by the students. And right now, in general, when you look at the difference of probably about almost 70%, or actually almost 60%, are funded by tuition fees, with the rest funded by state appropriations. One of our regents a while back asked for us to go back and look at Texas A&M University specific, And we went back to, I think, 1984, and it was actually the graph flipped. So back in the mid 80s, late 80s, it was about 2/3 came from the state of Texas and 1/3 came from tuition and fees. Today, after deregulation, it's flipped. And so I'm not saying that the state doesn't provide a lot of resources. They do, and those are very much appreciated and invested back into the education of our students. Many of those different revenue sources are enrollment driven. So you think about the general revenue that we get, and I know Clayton will talk a little bit about formula funding. They're enrollment driven. So when you think about the formula funding that we get in our state appropriations, nearly 60% of that, of what we receive is really enrollment driven. Tuition and fees, once again, enrollment driven. In a time, all y'all know, just dealing with, inflation, the cost of everything going up, people costs. A lot of what we do is people driven. When you look at our total budget of $7.3 billion, you can exclude our debt service. We're almost 60% people costs. So when we look at how do you deal with inflation, well, really it's really two things. You can cut your costs or increase your revenues. Add students, continue to recruit students and keep the students in the pipeline. So, but then we also have, I just put in the category of non-enrollment driven revenues. So the state also provides general revenue to pay for the health benefits associated with the employees. They provide special item support that comes to each of the universities. I know recently, just to give you an example, the state invested $200 million in a what we call it's kind of a space initiative for A&M they're working with on a NASA project. The state invested additional money with the system, $226 million, to deal with semiconductor research and manufacturing. And so, but we also have a lot of contract and grant revenue, so a lot of research is being done. So a lot of the research dollars are brought in from various sponsors. Investment income, is real important to funding our operations. This past year was a good year. Years before were not. So I do monitor our investment balances closely, and also sales and services. So those are things for athletic tickets, dorms, room and board, etc. And then royalty income. That's one of the initiatives of trying to increase the royalties that we receive through patents and other technologies that are patented by our members. But that's kind of just an overview that I have.
Thank you, Joseph. Wanted to remind everyone we'll have some time for questions at the end. So if you jot them down as we go, would love to hear some of your questions as we move through the session. Mike, could you talk a little bit about how at a health-related institution that revenue mix and how you're meeting your priorities is different than the typical?
Sure. So basically at the health-related institutions, to give you sort of an idea or a feel for the magnitude of on the UT side of the house, UT's overall budget's $32 billion. There are 15 institutions, 6 health-related institutions. Of that $32 billion, the health-related institutions, the 6, make up 2/3 of the budget. In all of our cases, tuition and state appropriations are a small amount of our overall budgets. At UT Health, it's roughly 13% of the total. 60% of our budget is attributed to our clinical enterprise. And what you'll see in health-related institutions across the state, if you've seen one health-related institution, you've seen one health-related institution, because we all differ just a bit. And it could range from, on one end of the spectrum, you have MD Anderson, and their sizable cancer center. They also have a health professions school there, as well as they share the Graduate School of Biomedical Sciences with UT Health in Houston. To UTMB, Southwestern, they all have tertiary care hospitals. And so a sizable portion of their revenue streams, their budgets, are attributed to running the hospitals and the associated clinics with it. UT Health San Antonio, I think just this past week, opened the doors to their brand new hospital. So they were unique in that respect. They were probably the most like UT Health in Houston, where I'm at, prior to that. UT Health Houston doesn't own a hospital. We are primarily people driven. We have over 2,500 healthcare providers, and we have sizable hospital partnerships with the Memorial Hermann system and with the Harris Health system, where we provide the physicians at their facilities. We are, again, unique in the stance that we also have the Dunn Behavioral Sciences campus, which is roughly 540 beds of inpatient psychiatric care that we operate on behalf of both Harris County and the state. So again, everybody has a little bit of a tweak in the way they manage their budgets. So much of it is related to patient-driven revenues, but a lot of it is also hospital contracts. They make up significant amounts of our budgets. The other big portion of our budgets, and we drop off from 60% of our budget being the clinical enterprise to our sponsored programs, our research, our public service sponsored programs amount to about 18 to 20% of our budget. And again, that will, waxes and wanes a bit from year to year. We have a School of Public Health, and their numbers jumped dramatically, as you would expect, during the COVID crisis. And so there's been a considerable amount there. I think the overall, as we look at the future, as we move forward, many of our clinical programs are also supported through supplemental programs coming through the federal government, through HHSC, and they're providing a significant amount of money, whether it's the CHIRP program or the TIPS program, things like that. These are probably, the CHIRP program, I think, is a $3 billion program for hospitals. The TIPS program is a $700 million program for physician practices. So, all in all, those are the things that, when we see considerations for supplemental payment programs being analyzed at the federal level, it causes a little heartburn, on the front line, because it does impact programs. And in our cases, it's all people and it's clinics. So it's all patient care related.
Thanks, Mike. One of the things that I hope that you take away from the panelists' answers there is that there is a huge variety of budget and financial management policies and practices and realities as you look across the state of Texas with our 36, 37, or 38 public four-year institutions, depending on how you count. From our smallest institution, probably in Alpine at Sol Ross with less than 2,000 students, to our largest in College Station. Really what I would encourage you, if you're especially new to your role as a region, is to learn more about those differences at your institutions, because painting with a broad brush is always a little tricky when you have this much variety across the state of Texas. Clayton, Joseph mentioned formula funding and how it is one of the primary ways that state funding is provided to institutions of higher education. Could you talk a little bit more about how that works?
Sure. So the formula funding mechanism of the state is just their way of taking whatever the money it chooses to give us and allocating it out in a as fair way as possible. And before I give you the details, the reason why it matters is because in the absence of that, it becomes almost a who you know. I came from a state where that was the case, and I remember the university grew by 20% over a few years, and the appropriation was up by, say, 5%. Another school fell by 25% over the same time, same appropriation as ours. It really was a who's your friend, and it creates very inequitable outcomes because if you're getting smaller because of enrollment, you should need less faculty because you're teaching less classes, but your appropriation is constant. You actually become wealthier, right? So the state of Texas has tried to have some semblance of a fair system. Fair is always relative, but I really appreciate how we do it here, and I'll give you details. But the biggest thing to remember is semester credit hours is very important for the senior state colleges, and Eric said there's close to 40 of us, right? In the appropriations formula, about 83% of it is for core operations. They call it instruction and operations. So think faculty members, so think teaching, think support staff, right? The payroll office. Think anything related to your core school operation, teaching, and anything related to that, and support functions. About 83% of the funding is related to that, and it's heavily driven by semester credit hours. So there is an incentive to program and meet more of the needs of the populace of the state, right? And then there's an infrastructure component, which is about 16%. So that's money for utilities and facilities and so forth. And then there's a smaller piece for certain regionals receive that money. It's 1% on average of the total pot of money, and it's for regionals that have at-risk students, right? So big picture is about $4 billion that's divvied up based on largely on semester credit hours, and there's a weighting, right? So if you have a lot of students that are doing engineering, the state gives that a higher weight. So for example, if I'm teaching 100 engineering students and someone else is teaching 100 liberal arts majors, so think English, okay? So you get more money for teaching your engineering students from the state of Texas because engineering is what we call a high-cost area. I think pharmacy is the highest across the entire state as far as the reimbursement rates. So the state has weightings in its reimbursements based on its formulas to help match your presumed cost with the actual money that you receive. There's also a 10% premium you receive if a tenured faculty member teaches a class, and the rationale behind that is someone that has been, on researching and on staff teaching for a while is more likely to be very good at what they do and gives the students a better outcome and helps connect them with internships. And there's also what we call a small school supplement. So if you have less than 10,000 students, there's a small amount of money you also receive. You get the full allotment up to, I think, 5,000 students, and then between 5,000 and 10,000 students, there's a small decrease in the amount that an institution receives. But overall, the state of Texas goes through this process every 2 years. So it awards the money for 2-year periods, and then it stays flat for 2 years. And to earlier comments where Michael was saying at his school is a health school, and their tuition is 13%. My tuition is 45%. So it's close to half. I get 20 cents on the dollar from the state of Texas. And the state of Texas, compared to the other states I've worked in, is actually generous and does a good job funding higher education. We'll always ask for more so we can continue to program more and meet the needs of the state. But, our budget is about $1 billion at our flagship. I'm at the flagship university in the University of North Texas system. So, our tuition is, we live and die on that. So if you can keep tuition flat at a health institution for a number of years, and it'll have minimal impact because they're going to be state operating grants or clinical revenues and other ways to make out. At a general academic institution like ours, we have grants activity, but we say grants kind of eat themselves. So the money comes in, but you got to spend all of it on equipment. And in fact, people feel that doing that type of research can actually cost you, meaning even if you get reimbursed, it takes money from the school, but it's done more to just advance the public good and help with branding and image. So across our spectrum, we do have a wide variety of different structures, but there is an incentive when you plan your budget to plan it around your expected enrollment, right? If you expect your enrollment is going to be down or these programs are not going to perform as well, you've got to factor that into your budget on the front end. Otherwise, it'll impact your fiscal outcomes.
Thank you, Clayton. Mike, we've mentioned that formula funding or state appropriations is a smaller portion of the HRI's budgets, although I know it's still an important one. How does the state appropriation and formula funding work with HRIs compared to the other institutions?
Well, in a lot of ways, it's very similar in that it is based oftentimes on FTSEs or, in the case of the professional schools, dental, medical, podiatry, those are really headcount driven. But whereas as tuition is a big part of the academics, the health relateds, even within the overall appropriation process, the tuition is a smaller piece. We, for the most part, the health relateds tend to fall on the bottom end of tuition rates. And so we're a tremendous value to our students and to the state. Now, the upside is, again, the state is generous in its support of students. And in our instruction and operations formula, we do have a varying rate of support based on the level of the program. It ranges from an allied health that has a weight of 1.0 to dentistry and medicine that's more at like 4.7. That's multiplied against the base rate. And that base rate is what remains the same for all schools. The base rate itself, I also have had the good fortune of serving as the chair of the Health Related Institutes Formula Funding Advisory Committee for the last two biennium. And unfortunately, what we've experienced is some degradation in the base rates over time. To give you a little bit of an example, when we started back in 2000, and I'm dating myself because I was around back then, the base rate was just over $11,000. Right now, it's right under $9,700. 25 years later, so we've lost some ground there. Now, the upside to this is that the overall funding picture has continued to improve. The legislature and has put more money into the overall pot. Thankfully, because growth itself is what we oftentimes end up covering during that period. The state of Texas is doing fantastic financially. It's been very successful attracting people from all across the country to come to Texas, businesses and residents. And with that, as you probably look around any of your communities where you see high schools popping up left and right, there's a demand for the professional schools, the health-related schools as well, to be able to take on more. In the last 10 years, we've seen a number of new medical schools come online. Sam Houston, U of H, RGV, Dell. So it's, the demand is there for the state. I think that the stats are we're probably 43rd out of 50 states when it comes to the number of doctors, per 100,000 residents. So it's a considerable demand in that respect. And so in this last session or last committee meeting that we went through the round, we actually have asked for, we want to look at growth. We want to request that amount of funding for growth, but we also want to factor in inflation. I think everyone can admit inflation over the last handful of years has had a significant impact. And we've looked at the CPI, the medical CPIs for the country, and have built that into our request. Overall, between growth and inflation, it's about a 20% increase in funding that we are requesting. And it's largely because, again, these are real costs. I mean, when people, I think when inflation was in the 2 to 3% range, people just thought inflation's just, the cost of doing business, and raises were staying on top of it and on pace with it. But when we have a few years where it's jumped 10, 12, 15%, and in the healthcare arena, especially during the pandemic, salaries went crazy. And you had traveling nurses who were making unbelievable sums of money, and staffing your hospital or staffing your clinics became very expensive. And I can't say unfortunate, but those salaries, as the pandemic ticked down, you saw some costs drop off. You didn't see salaries winding down. Now, the traveling nurse business did diminish, and most hospitals were gradually taking the stand that I can't afford to hire traveling nurses, and it was a difficult choice for many, because they were weighing, is it cheaper for me to just close a unit or to pay $200 an hour to a traveling nurse? And oftentimes the answer was, we'll just close the unit. And so, thankfully we worked through that. What we're now seeing from an enrollment standpoint is nursing has suffered. When you saw throughout the COVID pandemic, you'd see the nurses on the news and the traumatic experiences that they were having day in, day out. And we've seen a drop off in enrollment in that respect. And I think that's going to take a little bit to wind itself back up and reestablish that. That's where we do lose ground within health relateds, is when you have the new medical schools coming online, and then you have some of the other programs dropping off. Even though the overall funding for the programs are increasing to the pool, the individual programs can suffer. Not necessarily because they move forward, because they just didn't move fast enough. So it's, those are unique in that respect. We also have graduate medical education for, basically a formula that looks at our residents. That is somewhat unique, because one of the things that we know is that if a medical student stays in Texas for his residency, they're 80% more likely to stay in the state to practice. And so the goal is, as the medical school numbers grow, to have residency slots available to them to give that opportunity to those med students, those graduating med students, to stay at home, basically, and actually for the state to retain its investment. So outside of that, there's also a mission-specific formula that's unique to the health-related institutions. And that's broken into two different slices. One in part is clinical, and that's what helps to fund the cancer hospital at Anderson, UTMB's care at their hospitals, chest care in Tyler, as well as the most recent addition is Texas Tech El Paso. There's about 6 or 8 institutions that have research-related formulas, and this is where, again, the more research they generate from the federal government, from external sources, the greater amount that they would get based on this formula. Now, there is a governor on there, so it's not, it can't jump up and grow exponentially, but there is, there is some limits, and it's in the 5 to 10% range for the most part. So with those are really the unique things from the health-related side.
Thanks, Mike. I asked my colleagues to speak a little closer to the mic since we're being recorded, so that we capture everything that we're saying here. I found it interesting. Mike mentioned that their base rate in health-related ranges from sort of a 1 to a 4.7. So some sorts of programs pay about 5 times more in terms of appropriation than others. In the regular formula, and Clayton mentioned, pharmacy is the highest rated for the non-health related institutions. That range is about 16x. So a pharmacy student gets about 16 times more state appropriation than say a literature student, right? And so some people may think, well, then you should go and get a lot more pharmacy students, right? Because you get a lot more state funding. I like to always remind everyone that that is not meant to be an incentive program. It is meant to recognize the fact that it costs you 16 times more to educate that pharmacy student. So be careful sort of chasing formulas, because there's a reason that those numbers are the way they are. Clayton, I want to move away from the formula and just talk a little bit more about financial management at our institutions. Can you give some examples of how budgeting and financial management structures or processes vary at different institutions across the state of Texas?
Sure. So I think most or every institution in the state of Texas or system is going to be obligated to take reports to their board probably on a quarterly basis, some maybe a greater frequency. And on an annual basis, there is a budget every board is going to have to approve, and it's going to have its process where it goes through a review by their budget office, then it goes up to the cabinet, and things are added or subtracted, and then it goes up to the system for approval, then to the board, right? And it's a process that actually takes a number of months, because you're trying to forecast revenue and how do we expect to do in grants and housing and dining and athletics and so forth, because all those revenue and inputs affect the outcome. But different universities use different mechanisms to get there, right? So some use what we call an incremental approach. So they'll largely take whatever budget folks have, and they'll more so focus attention on just the things that people are asking for. So if you have a budget of 15 million in some department, but they're asking for 250,000, the attention is focused on the 250,000 that's being asked for to see if it's good or bad, right? But it's more incremental. That's where the focus is, right? There are others that do what we call RCM, so Responsibility Cost Center, where in large part every subunit in some fashion, once they have revenue, they're almost treated like a mini business, right? So there's a charge that's associated with every entity for the support costs that they receive, right? You've got central budgeting, where in large part the central university makes the majority of the decisions, and you have activity-based costing. In fact, in a lot of systems, for example, in our system, instead of having a payroll office for every entity across every campus, we have one payroll office for the entire system. It's payroll, right? So all payroll goes to that one office, and every campus pays a fee to support that payroll office based on headcount. So that's the proxy that's used for activity. We say, well, the more employees you have, the greater the share of the overall cost that campus should bear. They call that activity-based costing. There's also zero-based budgeting, where every year an entity or unit has to justify their entire budget. That's not very common, because it's a lot of work, right? Think of 16, 17 billion. Just imagine doing that, right? For 17 entities, it's a massive undertaking. It sounds good, and we've had that question sometimes come from folks on the outside as to why we don't do it. But that's the reason why. It's extremely time consuming, and it may not get you that outcome that you're looking for. But a lot of universities also incorporate what you call a contribution margin model to their budgeting format. So for every academic program, they make a determination as to cost. What does it cost? What's the cost of the salary for faculty members in this program relative to average revenue that physics or English or whatever your area is what it brings in. And that's important because it lets you know when you're trying to grow, if you're going to grow, are you making a surplus or a deficit? And we're all nonprofits, we're government, okay? But something that, we'll probably mention here at some point is that we all still need to make a surplus, right? This is not just a pure tree hugging operation. Now the folks on the front line on the programming side may view it that way, and that's fine. But on the back end, I want to assure you that Michael and Eric and these other folks here are calculating. In a soup kitchen, at some point, someone comes out and says, "Hey, I'm sorry, you're the last person we can serve tonight." Right? Someone has to be doing that. Otherwise, you'll go bankrupt and you can't serve the greater purpose of the state. So these different budget models are used by universities, and there's no right or wrong. In fact, for us, we use a hybrid of a few things. We're moving to what we call a strategic budget, where we're looking at our strategic plan and we're mapping revenue to different colleges based on their achievement of those strategic plan objectives. So there's no right or wrong. There's going to be a criticism regardless of what you do on your campus. But the key is to be diligent in reviewing information and just being diligent in making decisions that best serve the needs of our students. So,
Thank you, Clayton. We're coming to all of you next, but I have one more question. Joseph, can you tell us, we've learned a lot about formula funding, the sources of revenue that support our institutions, the different ways that budgets are done across our institutions. What do you see, and you've been in the A&M system for a long time to have a firsthand account of this, is the role of a board of regents in helping govern all of that?
Thanks, Eric. So, I've seen many boards, and each one's they're all different. Every 2 years we get different board members. I think, just from my perspective, just Joseph's opinion and things I've seen, is from being at the system office. Number one, our job is we provide is to serve the members. So serve the members. They're my number one priority, and serving the board. So I think in serving the board, one of the things that are important to me is that we have good communication with them, and that happens through up the chain through the chancellor's office. But good communication and good transparency. I think it's important that as a board job, one of the things they do is they provide financial oversight over all of our academics over the whole A&M system. So it's our job to make sure that we provide them with transparency with regard to Clayton mentioned the process. Well, each year we approve the budget. And so it's a 2-day process that we go through, and it's a 2 days set apart for each of our members to provide an overview of the budget that they're proposing. So I think it's important that we have good communication there. Also, that we carry out the initiatives that are important to the board. One of the things or several things, but back in 2018, the board created a special committee on deferred maintenance. So we've been paying close attention to our deferred maintenance. What I've told some of the board members and told our CFOs is that, the expectation is not that you get rid of all your deferred maintenance overnight, but it is important that we have identified where our deferred maintenance is, that we have prioritized it, and that we allocate what resources we can to the deferred maintenance. In our system, we have older universities and younger. So when we deal with our younger universities, San Antonio, for example, Central Texas, Texarkana, our goal is to make sure we don't have any deferred maintenance. They're new. We need to have plans that we just stay on top of it, because we don't want it to get out of hand. One of the comments that my boss made when he first got here, he goes, Joseph, I thought we educated students, but what we actually do is we build a lot of buildings. And he was, just trying to make a joke, but our capital plan is large. Right now, I looked it up before I came over here, and it's over $5 billion that we have. It's a 5-year capital plan. The board approves it each year. But one of the things we've changed is that if you're going to bring new construction, whether it's funded by the state or funded by the revenues of the university, you have to bring also we're calling it just a facilities maintenance plan. What is your plan to maintain that structure so that we're not adding to our deferred maintenance backlog? So those are the kind of things that we had a workshop that we actually didn't get to talk about it, but it was on agenda, but time ran out. But just to give them an update on deferred maintenance. The other things our board is interested in is just employee turnover and also student retention. And, I remember talking to one of our board members, and he was like, I think one of the things maybe we need to, instead of always, we have a lot of regional campuses. So instead of always looking, how can we increase enrollment, we just need to, let's focus on the kids we do have, for the 10,000 that we do have, and let's make sure we keep them in the pipeline. And a couple initiatives they came up with to allocate money is what they call a Regents Grant Awards. And so those are dollars allocated to our universities with the number one purpose of just keeping kids in the pipeline. You hear a lot of stories of, kid dropped out because they couldn't pay for whatever reason. They had a hardship and they couldn't pay a bill, and so they had to drop out. Well, we don't want that to happen. So these dollars are specific to keep the students in the pipeline. They have a Regent Scholarship Program where we're allocating money to our academics, and it's to recruit students. And so I think those are going very well. When we look at employee retention, those will be our salary plans each year. And so our board does take an interest in looking at turnover, faculty turnover, staff turnover, executive turnover, digging into where is the turnover happening, why is it happening. And so they understand, and I shared that we have a lot of invested employees. And, it's important that we continue to bring, I always call it young talent, and because we need to have some smart people coming in to replace us. And to bring them in, you're going to have to pay them. And so it's important that we're compensating them appropriately, because if you don't, they're going to leave. And one thing that happens in Brazos County a lot is that we steal from one another. So we look at that, and when we look at a turnover, we're looking also at, well, if you exclude all the folks that just hop from the system to the university or from the agency to the university or vice versa, what does turnover look like? So we're digging into that. Affordability is another issue the board has dealt with. I think a lot of y'all know, I think, if I'm correct, fall of 2021 was the last time that, at least with A&M system, that we had an across-the-board inflation adjustment of 2.1%. So since then, 22, 23, 24, and now looking ahead at 25, we don't have there's no plans to increase tuition fees. So the board is asking, well, how have y'all been able to make it? Because a lot of them, are interested in keeping, affordable, making sure that our universities are affordable for the students in the state of Texas that want to go to school. And so we are working on that right now. Our job is to make sure we communicate to them how we've been able to do it. Now, Clayton, as a CFO, he knows how he's been able to do it, but there's things you got to manage costs, look at increasing revenues. Managing costs, a lot is managing people costs. So a lot of our CFOs have what we call flexible hiring freezes, where they're looking at every time we're going to either add or replace or fill a vacancy. So there's a lot that we're doing to do that. But in general, when I think about the system and the board, I think communication and transparency are important.
Thanks, Joseph. Got a few minutes here at the end for any questions that you all may have, or anything about budgeting and financial management at our four-year institutions in the state of Texas. Yes.
Something I think the macro level is over the past 20 years, it seems the ratio of administrative costs to actual educational delivery costs has increased. I.e., administration is a greater percentage of overall budgets. Has that been true in your experience? And is there an awareness of that and what the impact might be to ultimate education outcomes and then driving student success in terms of salary and benefits they're getting outside of the university system?
So the question is about administrative costs growing at a faster clip than other sorts of costs in higher education. Any of the panelists like to tackle that one?
Mine.
Go ahead.
We do monitor it, and it is important. Our faculty costs for us have grown at a faster rate because we've tried to hold the administrative costs somewhat constant as much as possible. I think a bigger thing that has impacted us is, for us, as a flagship, we haven't increased our tuition in, I want to say about 6 years. But the inflation, so the revenue we've gotten is from additional enrollment. But if you're charging grocery store prices from 3 years ago, but the expenses are increasing. So we've seen strain and stress in our housing and dining because we're buying food, and you can't, you got to purchase the food from wherever they're selling in bulk, right? But we do pay attention to administrative costs, and there's a category called institutional support that, for those of you who have accountability as part of your role, that's a good thing to ask about. What is the institutional support cost per student, right? And I've actually run it for the majority of us, Eric. Thankfully, yours looked as good as well. As a competitor, I pay attention to, my peers. For most of us in the state, they're actually in a tight cluster where they're actually doing pretty good. The state of Texas as a whole does a very good job as far as tuition competitiveness for the average resident. So.
Yeah, Clayton, one of the things I would add to that is it is carefully measured and monitored. It's one of the key performance indicators that is reported to our Board of Regents on a regular basis. I'll just offer at my institution, the number in terms of the percentage of our expenditures that goes towards administration writ large is between 6 and 7%. And so it's any dollar that doesn't go towards instructing our students in a classroom is sort of a problem in many respects. But I always try to say that, leadership is important. And so some expenditures there do make sense. And you sort of don't fix the affordability problem in the state by addressing that 6 or 7%. Other questions that we might have? I have one that Dr. Julie Lessiter from our Vice President of the Texas State Round Rock campus gave me before the meeting. She recently came from Louisiana, where there's forms of performance-based funding for institutions of higher education. So most of the formula and aspects that we talked about here today, they're just sort of, how many students do you have, rather than how many do you graduate or what are your outcomes. Clayton, is there any performance-based funding in the four-year institutions that you're aware of, or those discussions? And then I would ask Mike the same thing about health-related. We just have a few minutes here to wrap up.
I would say most of ours are activity-based. The community colleges, I believe, have more of that. Ours are largely based on semester credit hours. So there is it is funding so we can meet the needs of our populace, but not necessarily tied to graduation rates and other, outcomes on the back end, retention and so forth.
Great. Mike?
Yeah, really, from the health related, the only one that would even somewhat be performance based would really be the research related formulas that are tied to that increase, assuming a growth in your overall research program. What you may hear from many as we look at the cost of doing research, what you'll typically find that it's somewhere between $1.40 to $1.50 of cost for the dollar that you generate in income from the grant. And so a lot of that has to do with cost sharing, salary caps, support for the research. So these type of performance driven formulas are key, because they are certainly, as you want to increase your research to increase the stature of the institution, but it does come with a cost and some tough decisions that oftentimes have to be made as to how much you can afford to do.
Thanks, Mike, and thanks to all of you. I admit that last question is really, some of you may hear a lot about performance-based funding, and if you attend the session later today for community college regents and trustees, that you'll hear a lot more about that. It's not as big a part of the formula funding for four-year institutions in Texas. As we wrap up, I want to thank our panelists for sharing this information with us. All of us are available to any of you if you have questions after the session. Appreciate you being here, and enjoy the rest of the conference.